October 15, 1945, Yamaguchi Prefecture, Japan. The autumn rain fell relentlessly on the small coastal village of Hatsushima, washing away the thin layer of dust that had settled after months of clear weather. Midori Tanaka stood in her doorway, watching the water pour through the gaping hole in her roof and pool on the tatami mats of what had once been her immaculate home. She believed the coming winter would claim what remained of her dwelling, and possibly her life as well. How wrong she would be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how an unexpected encounter between former enemies would transform not only their own lives, but an entire community's understanding of reconciliation in the shadow of the most devastating conflict in human history. The occupation forces had arrived in Hatsushima 3 weeks earlier. The village, situated 120 kilometers from Hiroshima, had been spared the direct devastation that had befallen other parts of Japan, but not the crushing poverty and scarcity that now gripped the entire nation. Food production across Japan had fallen to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Industrial output stood at a mere 15% of what it had been before the conflict. The average caloric intake for Japanese citizens had plummeted to 1,200 per day, barely enough for survival. For Midori, a woman of 42 years, the statistics were meaningless abstractions compared to her immediate reality. Her husband, Takeshi Tanaka, a civilian engineer who had been conscripted to work on military installations, had not returned from his assignment in the Philippines. The official notification of his death had arrived in August, just days after Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. Their only son, Kenji, had perished 2 years earlier during military training. At 42, Midori found herself entirely alone, the last of her family line. Captain William Davis of the United States Army stood at the command post established in what had formerly been Hatsushima's town hall. At 34 years old, the officer from Oregon had already witnessed enough tragedy to last several lifetimes. His unit, part of the 8th Army under General Robert Eichelberger, had been tasked with overseeing the occupation and reconstruction efforts in this region. The mission directives were clear: maintain order, prevent insurgency, distribute essential supplies, and begin the process of democratization. What these clinical objectives failed to capture was the human complexity of occupation, the uneasy coexistence of recent adversaries now forced into daily interaction. "Sir, the supply convoy is delayed again," reported Lieutenant Michael Henderson, a lanky 24-year-old from Nebraska, whose perpetually furrowed brow made him appear much older. "Headquarters says the bridge at Mihara is still under repair. They're rerouting through the mountain pass, but that adds another day at minimum." Davis sighed, removing his cap and running a hand through his close-cropped brown hair. "That's the 3rd delay this month. We're already rationing the rations, Henderson. What's our current food supply status?" 4 days at current distribution levels, sir. And the medical supplies are even lower. We have virtually no antibiotics left. The captain gazed out the window at the rain-soaked village. 627 civilians, according to the most recent census, plus 42 American personnel, all dependent on supply lines stretched across a devastated infrastructure. The occupation authorities had initially calculated that Japan would require imports of at least 2 million tons of food in the first year after surrender, just to prevent widespread starvation. The current pace of delivery was falling woefully short of that estimate. "Reduce the garrison's portions by 20%, Davis decided after a moment of contemplation. "Maintain civilian rations at current levels." "Sir?" Henderson's expression registered surprise. The standard protocol prioritized occupying forces. "You heard me, Lieutenant. I won't have children starving while we complain about missing seconds. Make it happen." "Yes, sir," Henderson responded, though his hesitation was evident. Among the American soldiers stationed in Hatsushima was Private First Class Samuel Cooper, a 20-year-old from rural Tennessee. Unlike many of his comrades, Cooper had not seen direct combat during the conflict. He had enlisted in early 1945, completed accelerated basic training, and arrived in the Pacific Theater just as the fighting concluded. This timing had spared him the horrors of battle, but not the challenges of occupation duty. Cooper sat on an empty ammunition crate beneath the minimal shelter of a pine tree, his uniform already soaked despite his efforts to stay dry. His 6-foot frame was significantly thinner than when he had arrived in Japan. The reduced rations affected everyone, but especially those with his naturally lean build. As he attempted to open a can of field rations with stiff fingers, Cooper watched the Japanese villagers hurrying through the downpour, heads bowed not just against the rain, but seemingly against life itself. "Not exactly what you pictured when you signed up, is it, Coop?" The voice belonged to Corporal Frank Rossi, a 23-year-old from Boston who had fought at Okinawa and carried both physical and invisible scars from the experience. Cooper shrugged. "Beats getting shot at, I reckon." "Some days I'm not so sure," Rossi replied, settling beside him with a grunt. "At least in combat you knew who was who and what was what. This," he gestured vaguely at the village, "this is something else entirely. We're supposed to be helping the same people we were killing a few months ago. Makes my head spin." Cooper didn't respond immediately. His attention had been caught by an elderly Japanese man attempting to carry a bundle of bamboo poles through the mud, stumbling repeatedly as the weight and the slippery ground conspired against him. Without conscious thought, Cooper set aside his half-opened ration can and strode toward the man. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, knowing the man wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone and gestures would convey his intent. The old man, Hiroshi Yamamoto, 73 years old and a former schoolteacher, flinched visibly as the tall American approached. His weathered face, already lined by decades of life, seemed to collapse further into a mask of apprehension. He clutched the bamboo poles tighter, knuckles whitening with effort. Cooper stopped, raising his open hands in a universal gesture of peaceful intent. "It's okay," he said softly, pantomiming carrying the poles. "Let me help." For several heartbeats, the two men stood frozen in tableau, the young American soldier and the elderly Japanese civilian separated by language, culture, recent history, and a chasm of mutual incomprehension. Rain continued to fall around them, indifferent to human divisions. Then, with palpable reluctance, Yamamoto loosened his grip on the bamboo. Cooper carefully took the bundle, surprised by its weight despite his youth and strength. He gestured for the old man to lead the way. After a moment's hesitation, Yamamoto bowed slightly and turned, walking with slow dignity toward a small house at the village edge. From her doorway, Midori observed this unexpected interaction. She had known Yamamoto-sensei all her life. He had taught her calligraphy when she was a girl. The sight of an American soldier, one of the foreign conquerors, assisting the elderly man stirred complicated emotions. The occupiers were supposedly here to help, according to the official pronouncements, but reconciling this claim with the devastation of defeat required more understanding than many in Hatsushima could muster. The hole in Midori's roof had appeared during the last typhoon season. In previous years, Takeshi would have repaired it immediately, his engineer's hands skilled with practical tasks. Now, with building materials nearly impossible to obtain and male labor scarce in the village, the damage had remained unaddressed. Each rainfall worsened the situation, water seeping into the wooden structure of the house and threatening its integrity. As Midori watched the American soldier and Yamamoto-sensei disappear around a corner, an idea began to form in her mind. It was unconventional, perhaps even dangerous in these uncertain times, but desperation has always been a powerful motivator for innovation. That evening, as Cooper returned to the American encampment established at the former elementary school building, he was approached by Lieutenant Henderson. "Cooper," the officer called, "Captain wants to see you." "Am I in trouble, sir?" Cooper asked, mentally reviewing his actions of the day for potential infractions. Henderson's expression remained neutral. "Not that I'm aware of, just follow me." Cooper was led to the school principal's office, now serving as Captain Davis's headquarters. The captain sat behind a desk covered with maps, reports, and the paraphernalia of administration. "Private Cooper reporting as ordered, sir," Cooper announced, standing at attention. Davis looked up from his paperwork. "At ease, Cooper. I understand you helped an elderly Japanese civilian today." Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. He was struggling with some bamboo poles in the rain. I just carried them to his house for him. Any particular reason? The question confused Cooper. Reason, sir? Yes, Private. What prompted you to help him? Cooper hesitated, uncertain of the expected response. He needed help, sir. My mama raised me to help folks who need it. Didn't seem complicated at the time. Davis studied the young soldier thoughtfully. You understand our position here is delicate, Cooper. The Japanese civilians are still adjusting to defeat and occupation. Our actions carry weight beyond their immediate impact. Have I caused a problem, sir? Quite the opposite, actually, Davis replied, his expression softening slightly. The village headman, Nakamura, mentioned the incident during our meeting this afternoon. He seemed surprised, in a positive way. Cooper relaxed marginally. I'm glad to hear that, sir. The thing is, Cooper, Davis continued, leaning forward, we're trying to establish a new relationship with these people. Not as conquerors, but as, well, something else. Something better. Your small act of kindness did more for that goal than a dozen official directives. Thank you, sir. I'm not finished, Private. I'm temporarily assigning you to community relations duty. You'll work with Sergeant Wilson on civilian assistance projects. Your first assignment comes directly from me. Cooper blinked in surprise. What would that be, sir? There's a widow named Tanaka who lives near the eastern edge of the village. Her roof is damaged. Tomorrow you're going to help her fix it. The following morning dawned clear after the night's rain. The sky washed to a pristine blue that seemed almost offensive in its beauty, given the circumstances below. Cooper made his way through the village, following the directions provided by Captain Davis. He carried a small toolkit, assembled from unit supplies and his own meager possessions. Finding Midori Tanaka's house proved simple enough. The damaged roof was visible from some distance. As Cooper approached, he noticed a slender woman in a faded indigo kimono sweeping water from the entrance area. She looked up at his approach, her face a careful mask devoid of expression. Cooper removed his helmet and bowed awkwardly, mimicking what he had observed of Japanese customs. "Ma'am," he began, then realized the futility of English. Instead, he pointed to the roof and then to himself, pantomiming hammering and repair work. Midori studied him silently. Close up, Cooper could see she was middle-aged, her face bearing the distinctive hollowness that had become common among Japanese civilians, dealing with prolonged food shortages. Despite this, there remained a dignity in her posture, a composed elegance that hardship had failed to erode. After a long moment, she nodded once and gestured for him to follow her around the side of the house. There, to Cooper's surprise, lay a neatly organized collection of repair materials. Bamboo poles similar to those he had helped Yamamoto carry, some wooden planks of various sizes, coils of rope, and bundles of thatch. Midori pointed to the supplies, then to the roof, then made a gesture that Cooper interpreted as an inquiry about his ability to perform the task. "Yes, ma'am," he said, nodding enthusiastically. "I can fix it. I helped build barns back home." Though his words meant nothing to her, his confidence apparently registered. Midori nodded again and, to Cooper's further surprise, rolled up her kimono sleeves in a practical manner and picked up one of the smaller bamboo poles, clearly indicating her intention to assist. For the next several hours, they worked together in near silence, establishing a wordless communication system of gestures, nods, and occasional smiles when progress became evident. Cooper was impressed by Midori's strength and practical knowledge. She clearly understood construction principles, handing him exactly the materials he needed, often before he realized he needed them. By midday, they had created a scaffolding system that allowed access to the damaged portion of the roof. The heat had intensified, and Cooper had removed his uniform jacket, working in his undershirt. He noticed Midori glancing at his thinned frame with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. As they paused for a brief rest, Midori disappeared into the house. Cooper continued working, driving improvised bamboo pegs into the roof structure to secure the repair framework. A few minutes later, Midori returned carrying a small tray with 2 cups of tea and what appeared to be rice balls wrapped in seaweed. Cooper stared at the offered food in astonishment. He knew enough about the local conditions to understand what such a gesture represented. Food sharing was no small matter in a community facing starvation. He looked at Midori questioningly, giving her a chance to reconsider. Instead, she pressed one of the rice balls into his hand and spoke her first words to him. "Onigiri, eat." The simple rice ball, containing a small pickled plum at its center, was perhaps the most humble meal Cooper had ever been offered. It was also one of the most profound. He ate slowly, savoring each grain, understanding that he was consuming food that Midori herself desperately needed. "Thank you," he said when finished, bowing deeply. "Thank you very much." Whether she understood his words or merely his tone, Midori acknowledged his gratitude with a slight nod before returning to work. Cooper followed her lead, his movements energized not just by the modest caloric intake, but by the unexpected human connection. The day progressed, the repair taking shape under their combined efforts. At one point, Cooper observed a group of village children gathering at a distance, watching the unusual partnership with undisguised curiosity. When Cooper waved, they scattered like startled birds, only to regroup minutes later, slightly closer than before. By late afternoon, the major structural work was complete. What remained was the final layer of thatching to make the roof weatherproof. As they worked on this phase, Cooper began humming without conscious thought, an old Appalachian folk tune his grandfather had taught him. After a few minutes, he noticed that Midori had paused in her work, listening. Embarrassed, he stopped. "No," she said, surprising him again with English. "Good. Continue." Cooper smiled and resumed humming, then transitioned to singing softly. "The water is wide, I cannot cross over. Neither have I wings to fly. Build me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row, my love and I." As the last notes faded, Cooper noticed Midori had closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she spoke a single word in Japanese that needed no translation. "Beautiful." Then, to his amazement, she began to sing in a clear, controlled voice, a traditional Japanese folk song about cherry blossoms and changing seasons. Though Cooper understood none of the words, the melody carried a poignancy that transcended language. When she finished, they regarded each other differently, as if some invisible barrier had thinned between them. The roof was completed as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Cooper and Midori stood back to assess their work. The repair was visibly different from the original construction, more utilitarian, less elegant, but it would keep the house dry and secure through the approaching winter. Midori bowed formally to Cooper. "Arigatou gozaimasu," she said, the traditional expression of gratitude. "You're welcome," Cooper replied, bowing in return. "Happy to help." As he gathered his tools to depart, Midori disappeared once more into the house. She returned moments later with a small package wrapped in cloth, which she pressed into Cooper's hands despite his protests. "For tomorrow," she said in halting English. "Come." Cooper understood she was inviting him to return the following day and offering food again, a gesture of extraordinary generosity under the circumstances. He hesitated, uncertain of the proper protocol or the potential complications. "I don't want to take your food," he said, trying to return the package. "You need it more than me." Midori's expression turned surprisingly stern. She refused to take the package back and repeated firmly, "Tomorrow, come." Recognizing the determination in her stance, Cooper relented with a respectful nod. "Tomorrow," he agreed. As Cooper made his way back to the American encampment, his mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. He had arrived in Japan expecting to find an enemy, indoctrinated by years of wartime propaganda about Japanese fanaticism and cruelty. Instead, he had encountered a woman of remarkable resilience and unexpected generosity. Upon his return, Cooper was immediately summoned to Captain Davis's office to report on his assignment. The captain listened with interest as Cooper described the day's work, his expression thoughtful. "She fed you?" Davis asked, seeming particularly struck by this detail. "Yes, sir, rice balls at midday, and she sent food with me when I left, plus invited me back tomorrow. I tried to refuse, sir, knowing how scarce food is for civilians, but she insisted." Davis leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Do you understand what happened today, Cooper?" "I fixed a roof." "Sir?" "No, Private. You participated in something much more significant. The sharing of food in Japanese culture, especially in times of scarcity, is a deeply meaningful act. Mrs. Tanaka didn't just feed you, she extended a form of acceptance that few Americans have received since we arrived. Cooper absorbed this information silently. You will return tomorrow as invited, Davis continued, and you'll take something with you. He opened a drawer and removed a small package. Our medical supplies are limited, but Dr. Reynolds confirms that Mrs. Tanaka's name appears on the list of civilians requiring nutritional supplements. You'll deliver these vitamins with my compliments. Yes, sir. One more thing, Cooper. How's your Japanese? Non-existent, sir. Though Mrs. Tanaka seems to know a few words of English. We have a Japanese-American interpreter, Sergeant Nakamura, who's been helping with official communications. I'll arrange for him to give you some basic language lessons. Communication is essential for what we're trying to accomplish here. Cooper raised an eyebrow. Which is what exactly, sir? Davis's expression turned serious. The rebuilding of a nation, Cooper. Not just physically, but spiritually. The Japanese people have been fed a steady diet of propaganda about Americans, just as we have about them. Breaking through those preconceptions is the first step toward a different future. Cooper departed with a deeper appreciation for the captain's perspective and a growing sense that his role in Hatsushima might extend beyond basic occupation duties. That night, as he lay on his cot in the crowded barracks, Cooper carefully unwrapped the package Midori had given him. Inside were 3 more rice balls, these containing small pieces of pickled vegetables. Such luxuries had become exceedingly rare in post-surrender Japan, where agricultural production had been devastated and fishing fleets largely destroyed. Corporal Rossi observed from the neighboring cot. "Where'd you score the chow, Coop?" Cooper hesitated before answering truthfully. "A Japanese widow gave it to me. I helped fix her roof today." Rossi's expression registered disbelief. "You're eating food from a Jap civilian? Are you crazy? It could be poisoned." "It's not poisoned, Frank," Cooper replied with certainty. "She ate the same food herself. Still, man, taking food from these people doesn't sit right. They don't have enough for themselves." "That's exactly why it matters," Cooper said quietly, remembering Captain Davis's words about the cultural significance of food sharing. "She chose to give it." Rossi shook his head. "You're getting soft, Cooper. Remember what these people did to our boys." Cooper thought carefully before responding. "The way I see it, Frank, there's been enough suffering on all sides. Maybe it's time for something different." The next morning, Cooper awoke before dawn, his mind already active with thoughts of the day ahead. He had arranged with Lieutenant Henderson to continue his special assignment at Midori's house, justified as community relations and civilian infrastructure support. Before departing the camp, Cooper sought out Sergeant Daniel Nakamura, the Japanese-American interpreter Captain Davis had mentioned. Nakamura, a 28-year-old Nisei from California, had a complicated relationship with his assignment. His own family remained in an internment camp back in the United States while he served the country that had imprisoned them. "Captain Davis mentioned you might be stopping by," Nakamura said when Cooper found him organizing translation materials in a corner of the headquarters building. "You want to learn some Japanese?" "Just enough to be polite," Cooper explained. "I'm working with a civilian widow, and the language barrier makes things difficult." Nakamura studied him with curious eyes. "Most of the guys don't bother. They figure the Japanese should learn English since we won." Cooper shrugged. "Seems to me winning means you can afford to be considerate." A smile briefly illuminated Nakamura's serious face. "That's an enlightened view, Private." He proceeded to teach Cooper several basic phrases: greetings, expressions of gratitude, simple questions about well-being, and, at Cooper's specific request, how to compliment someone's cooking. Armed with this linguistic preparation and the vitamin supplements provided by Captain Davis, Cooper made his way once more to Midori's house. He found her already awake and active, the repaired roof now adorned with several small potted plants arranged along its edge. "Ohayo gozaimasu," Cooper said carefully, using the morning greeting Nakamura had taught him. Midori's eyes widened slightly in surprise before she responded with a formal bow. "Ohayo gozaimasu, Cooper-san." The honorific suffix attached to his name indicated a level of respect that Cooper recognized from Nakamura's brief cultural explanation. He presented the vitamins, explaining in his limited Japanese and expansive gestures that they were medicine to help with strength. Midori accepted the gift with appropriate formality, but seemed uncertain about its purpose. Cooper mimed taking the tablets with meals, which elicited understanding and a nod of gratitude. What followed was a day unlike any Cooper had experienced during his military service. Rather than continuing work on the now repaired roof, Midori led him on a tour of Hatsushima. She showed him the small shrine at the village center, the fishing docks where only a few boats remained operational, and the community rice paddies, where women and elderly men labored to salvage what they could of the harvest. Throughout their walk, Cooper was acutely aware of the stares from other villagers. Some expressions contained hostility, others mere curiosity, but all reflected the abnormality of their partnership. A Japanese widow and an American soldier, walking side by side through a community still processing the trauma of defeat. Midori seemed either oblivious to or unconcerned by the attention. She spoke continuously in Japanese, occasionally inserting an English word when she knew one, pointing out features of village life and local landmarks. Cooper understood perhaps one word in 20, but remained attentive, recognizing that the content of her speech mattered less than the act of sharing itself. At midday, they returned to Midori's house. To Cooper's surprise, several other villagers had gathered there, including Yamamoto-sensei, the elderly man whose bamboo Cooper had carried during the rainstorm. Midori spoke rapidly to the assembled group, gesturing toward Cooper and then to the newly repaired roof. There followed what appeared to be a serious discussion, with occasional glances in Cooper's direction. He stood awkwardly, uncertain of his role in this unexpected gathering. Finally, Yamamoto stepped forward and addressed Cooper in surprisingly functional English. "Tanaka-san says you fixed her roof very well. She asks if you would teach others how to make repairs. Many houses damaged, few men to fix." Cooper blinked in surprise. "I'd be happy to help, but I'd need permission from my commanding officer." When this was translated, a ripple of discussion moved through the group. Yamamoto eventually responded, "We understand military duties first, but if permitted, we would be grateful for knowledge." "I'll speak with my captain today," Cooper promised. "I think he'll approve." This exchange marked a turning point, not just for Cooper, but for the relationship between the occupation forces and Hatsushima village. When Cooper brought the villagers' request to Captain Davis that evening, the officer immediately recognized its strategic as well as humanitarian value. "This is exactly the kind of initiative we need, Cooper," Davis said, his typically stern expression softened by evident satisfaction. "I'll assign you and 3 other men with construction experience to this project. We'll allocate some basic materials from our supplies as well." "Thank you, sir," Cooper responded, genuinely pleased. "I think it could make a real difference for the village before winter." "It's more than that," Davis mused almost to himself. "It's a template for the larger occupation, teaching rather than simply doing, partnership rather than paternalism." He refocused on Cooper. "You've stumbled onto something important here, Private, something that could extend well beyond Hatsushima." Over the following week, Cooper found himself at the center of an unlikely construction training program. With Sergeant Nakamura serving as translator, Cooper and 3 other American soldiers with relevant skills began teaching basic repair techniques to a group of villagers consisting primarily of women, teenagers, and elderly men. The initial sessions were characterized by awkwardness and hesitation on both sides. The Japanese participants approached the Americans with visible caution, while the soldiers struggled to simplify their instructions for translation. Cultural differences in construction methods created additional complications. American techniques often emphasized speed and efficiency, while traditional Japanese carpentry valued precision and longevity. Yet under the patient guidance of Midori, who had emerged as an unexpected liaison between the 2 groups, a functional working relationship gradually developed. By the 3rd day, mixed teams of Americans and Japanese were collaboratively addressing structural problems throughout the village. For Cooper, the most significant development was his evolving relationship with Midori herself. Through a combination of Nakamura's translations, Cooper's growing Japanese vocabulary, Midori's limited English, and an increasingly sophisticated system of gestures, they established a means of meaningful communication. He learned that she had been a teacher before the conflict, specializing in literature and calligraphy. Her husband had designed irrigation systems and small bridges before being drafted into service. Their son had been studying engineering, following his father's path, when military conscription claimed him. In turn, Cooper shared details of his life in rural Tennessee, his family's small farm, his education in a one-room schoolhouse, his dreams of becoming a carpenter after military service. He described the Great Smoky Mountains with their morning mists, the vibrant autumn colors, and the tight-knit community where he had been raised. These exchanges occurred during evening meals at Midori's house, where she had begun inviting not just Cooper, but other American soldiers and villagers participating in the repair program. What started as simple necessity, coordinating the next day's work, evolved into something more profound, a cultural exchange conducted over modest portions of whatever food could be assembled. Captain Davis, initially concerned about the informality of these gatherings, eventually recognized their diplomatic value and provided additional rations to supplement the meals without undermining Midori's role as hostess. It was a delicate balance, respecting her dignity while acknowledging reality. On the 10th evening of this arrangement, as the mixed group of Americans and Japanese shared a meal of rice supplemented with vegetables from the village gardens and protein from American rations, Midori made an announcement through Sergeant Nakamura. Tanaka-san wishes to express her gratitude for the roof repair that began our cooperation. Nakamura translated. She says that while she initially hired Private Cooper because she saw he was hungry and needed food as payment, she has come to understand that there are many kinds of hunger. She believes our two peoples hunger for understanding as much as for bread. Cooper felt a wave of emotion at these words, recognizing their profound truth. The official narrative of occupation focused on material reconstruction and political reformation. But Midori had identified something more fundamental: the human need for connection across dividing lines. As the gathering concluded and the participants dispersed into the autumn evening, Cooper remained behind to help Midori clear away the meal remnants. They worked in comfortable silence until Midori spoke softly. "Cooper-san," she said, placing a hand on his arm to ensure his attention. "Tomorrow. Special day." "Special?" he repeated, unsure of her meaning. Midori nodded, her expression both solemn and anticipatory. "Obon. For spirits. For remembering." Cooper had heard of Obon from Sergeant Nakamura, a Japanese Buddhist festival honoring ancestral spirits. That it would be observed even amid the devastation of defeat and occupation spoke to its deep cultural significance. "Your husband and son," Cooper said gently. "You remember them." Midori's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "Hi, and your lost ones too." The simple recognition that losses existed on both sides, that grief transcended national boundaries, created a moment of perfect understanding between them. Cooper nodded, unable to speak, past the sudden tightness in his throat. "You come," Midori said, making it both invitation and gentle command. "All soldiers welcome. Remember together." As Cooper walked back to the American encampment that night, the stars unusually brilliant above the darkened village, he reflected on how dramatically his understanding had evolved in just 2 weeks. The enemy had become individuals with names, histories, and sorrows that mirrored his own. The abstract mission of occupation had transformed into specific human relationships. The following morning, Cooper approached Captain Davis with Midori's invitation to the Obon observance. The captain listened thoughtfully, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Obon," Davis repeated, considering the word. "Sergeant Nakamura mentioned this tradition. It's essentially a festival for honoring the dead, correct?" "Yes, sir," Cooper confirmed. "Mrs. Tanaka has invited our men to participate. She specifically mentioned that it would be an opportunity to remember the fallen on both sides." Davis rose from behind his desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the village where small groups of Japanese civilians could be seen making preparations for the evening ceremonies. Paper lanterns were being hung from bamboo poles, and temporary altars appeared in front of several homes. The occupation directives discourage American personnel from participating in local religious practices, Davis said, his tone measured. The concern is that it might be interpreted as endorsement of Shintoism, which the Japanese government weaponized during the conflict. Cooper remained silent, sensing the captain was working through his thoughts aloud, rather than delivering a final decision. However, Davis continued after a moment, this appears to be primarily a cultural rather than political observance, and establishing respectful relations with the civilian population is central to our mission. He turned back to face Cooper. I'll allow volunteer participation, provided it remains appropriately solemn and respectful. No more than 8 personnel at any given time, to avoid overwhelming the ceremony. Sergeant Nakamura will accompany as cultural liaison and interpreter. Thank you, sir, Cooper responded, relief evident in his voice. Davis nodded, then added, I'd like you to understand something, Cooper. What's happening here in Hatsushima, this cooperation between our forces and the local population, is not typical of the occupation as a whole. You've helped create something unusual, something that may serve as a model elsewhere if successful. Cooper absorbed this information with surprise. I didn't realize that, sir. It seems like a natural development given our circumstances. Natural to you, perhaps, Davis said with the hint of a smile, but not to everyone. The wounds of war are still fresh. Many Americans struggle to view Japanese civilians as distinct from the military forces we fought against. Similarly, many Japanese view all Americans as conquerors rather than partners in reconstruction. Mrs. Tanaka doesn't seem to hold those views, Cooper observed. No, she doesn't, Davis agreed, and that makes her as exceptional among her people as your attitude makes you among ours, which is precisely why this cultural exchange matters. Exceptional individuals can sometimes bridge divides that armies cannot cross. That evening, as twilight descended on Hatsushima, Cooper led a group of 7 American soldiers toward the village center. All had volunteered after hearing Cooper's explanation of the Obon observance. Some, like Corporal Rossi, came primarily out of curiosity. Others, like Private James Miller, who had lost a brother at Iwo Jima, sought something more profound. Perhaps a way to process grief that military stoicism typically discouraged. Sergeant Nakamura walked slightly ahead. His unique position as both Japanese and American, making him the ideal intermediary for this unprecedented interaction. He had spent the afternoon briefing the soldiers on appropriate behavior during the ceremony, emphasizing the need for respectful silence and careful observation of local customs. As they approached the village square, the Americans were struck by the transformation that had occurred. Paper lanterns illuminated the space with a warm, flickering light that softened the visible signs of poverty and deprivation. Small altars decorated with food offerings, photographs, and personal items had been arranged throughout the area. Incense smoke created shifting veils in the evening air, carrying a sweet, resinous scent. The villagers had gathered in family groups, their expressions solemn yet not entirely somber. There was an undercurrent of celebration mixed with the grief, a recognition that remembrance could be an act of joy as well as sorrow. Many wore traditional kimonos that had been carefully preserved despite the material hardships of recent years. When the American soldiers appeared at the edge of the gathering, a momentary hush fell over the crowd. Then Midori stepped forward, dressed in a formal black kimono with a simple white obi. She bowed deeply to the visitors before addressing them through Sergeant Nakamura. Tanaka-san welcomes you to Hatsushima's Obon observance, Nakamura translated. She says that tonight we honor those who have passed from this world, but remain connected to us through memory and love. She invites you to join in remembering your own lost ones alongside her people. Cooper noticed several elderly villagers regarding the Americans with undisguised skepticism. One old woman whispered to her neighbor, her expression troubled. Nakamura heard the comment and leaned toward Cooper. Some are concerned about the appropriateness of former enemies participating in what is traditionally a family observance, he explained quietly. They're asking if Americans can truly understand their customs. Before Cooper could respond, Midori spoke again, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air. Though most of the Americans couldn't understand her words, the conviction in her tone was unmistakable. Tanaka-san says that grief knows no nationality, Nakamura translated as she finished. She reminds her neighbors that the ancestors we honor tonight would not want their descendants to perpetuate division. She says that healing begins with shared remembrance. These words seem to settle over the gathering like a gentle rain, softening resistance without washing it away entirely. The village priest, an elderly man named Takahashi, stepped forward and began the ceremony with a series of ritual chants and prayers. Sergeant Nakamura provided occasional whispered explanations to the American soldiers, helping them navigate the unfamiliar spiritual terrain. He's inviting the spirits of the ancestors to return for a brief visit, or this represents the symbolic feeding of the dead. As the ceremony progressed, Cooper found himself standing near Midori before her family altar. The simple wooden structure held photographs of two men, one middle-aged with kind eyes behind round spectacles, the other barely out of boyhood with the same thoughtful expression. Husband and son, Cooper realized, Takeshi and Kenji Tanaka, whose absence had left Midori alone to face the harsh post-surrender world. Beside the photographs stood small plates containing rice balls, sliced persimmons and cups of sake, offerings for spirits who could no longer eat but were nourished by the gesture itself. A thin trail of smoke rose from an incense holder, supposedly creating a path for the spirits to follow home. Without prompting, Cooper removed from his pocket a small photograph of his own, his older brother Edward, who had died at Normandy the previous year. He placed it carefully beside the Tanaka family photographs and bowed as he had seen the Japanese do. Midori's eyes widened at this unexpected action. She looked from the photograph to Cooper, a question in her expression. "My brother," Cooper explained simply. "Edward." Understanding bloomed in Midori's face. She nodded once, then reached out to touch the edge of Edward's photograph with gentle fingers. "Cooper-san no Ani," she said softly. "Your older brother." This moment of connection, two people from enemy nations united by shared loss, did not go unnoticed by others in the gathering. Several villagers watched with expressions ranging from surprise to reluctant approval. Among the American soldiers, a similar shift occurred as the abstract concept of honoring all fallen transformed into the concrete reality of specific lives lost on both sides. Corporal Rossi, who had approached the ceremony with barely concealed skepticism, found himself standing before the altar of the Yamamoto family. The elderly schoolteacher was carefully arranging offerings for his deceased wife and son. Without understanding the specific rituals, Rossi nonetheless recognized the universal language of grief. He removed his helmet in a gesture of respect that required no translation. As the evening progressed, the formal ceremony transitioned into the Bon Odori. Traditional folk dances performed in a circle around a central platform where drummers created a hypnotic, pulsing rhythm. Villagers of all ages joined the dance, their movements creating patterns that told stories of ancestors, seasons, and the cyclical nature of existence. Initially, the Americans stood back, observing rather than participating. Then a young Japanese woman, perhaps 16 years old, approached Private Miller with a tentative smile and a gesture of invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Miller joined the circle, his movements awkward but earnest as he attempted to follow the traditional steps. One by one, other soldiers were drawn into the dance, their self-consciousness gradually dissolving as the rhythms and repetitive movements created a sense of community that transcended cultural differences. Cooper found himself dancing between Midori and Yamamoto-sensei, their patient guidance helping him navigate the unfamiliar choreography. Captain Davis, who had arrived quietly during the ceremony, stood at the periphery watching this unexpected integration with an expression of thoughtful assessment. When Sergeant Nakamura approached to offer an explanation of the proceedings, Davis waved him off. "No translation needed, Sergeant," he said. "I believe I understand what's happening here." As the dancing concluded and the gathering began to disperse, Midori approached Captain Davis directly. Though they had met previously in official contexts, this was the first time she had initiated contact. She spoke briefly, her manner formal but determined. Nakamura translated, "Tanaka-san wishes to thank you for allowing your men to participate in tonight's observance. She says it has meant more to the village than you might realize. Davis bowed slightly, demonstrating the cultural sensitivity he encouraged in his men. Please tell Mrs. Tanaka that we are honored by the invitation. The opportunity to share in her traditions has benefited my men as well. When this was translated, Midori nodded and continued speaking, her words coming more rapidly now, with occasional gestures toward the village and the departing American soldiers. She says that tonight has shown what might be possible between our peoples, Nakamura translated, his own expression reflecting interest in the conversation. She suggests that perhaps Hatsushima could become a place of greater cooperation, a model for the larger occupation. Davis regarded Midori with heightened attention. What specifically does she propose? What followed was a conversation that would ultimately transform not only Hatsushima, but potentially the nature of American-Japanese relations in the early occupation period. Midori, speaking with the authority that her community had informally granted her, proposed a series of cooperative initiatives, joint agricultural projects to increase local food production, educational exchanges, where villagers and American personnel could teach each other their respective languages and skills, and a coordinated approach to infrastructure repair that would benefit both the civilian population and the occupation force. These are ambitious proposals, Davis observed when Nakamura had finished translating. Implementation would require resources and authorization beyond my immediate authority. Midori listened to the translation, then responded with a single sentence that Nakamura rendered as, "Great journeys begin with small steps taken together." The captain smiled at the proverb. "Indeed they do, Mrs. Tanaka, and I believe Hatsushima has already begun that journey." Over the following weeks, Midori's vision began to materialize through a combination of grassroots initiative and Captain Davis's strategic advocacy with his superiors. The roof repair program expanded into a broader construction initiative with mixed teams of Americans and Japanese working to restore Hatsushima's infrastructure. What had begun with Cooper helping Midori evolved into a community-wide effort that addressed not just immediate needs, but long-term resilience. Cooper found himself at the center of these developments, his role shifting from simple laborer to unofficial liaison between the occupation forces and the village population. His growing facility with basic Japanese, combined with his natural empathy and practical skills, made him uniquely suited to bridge the cultural divide. Midori, meanwhile, emerged as the heart of this collaborative experiment. Her home became an informal community center where planning sessions and language exchanges occurred almost daily. The modest dwelling that Cooper had helped repair now served as neutral ground where former enemies could interact as partners in reconstruction. One morning in early December, as the first winter frost crystallized on Hatsushima's fields, Cooper arrived at Midori's house to find her engaged in what appeared to be a significant project. The main room had been rearranged, with the central table covered in papers, writing materials, and several books. "What's all this?" Cooper asked in his improving Japanese. Midori looked up with evident excitement. "We are making books," she explained, switching to English for clarity. "For children, for learning." Cooper examined the materials more closely and realized they were creating simple educational texts, picture books with basic vocabulary in both Japanese and English, arithmetic primers, and illustrated stories. "The school has no books," Midori continued. "All burned or taken during war, children need to learn." Cooper nodded understanding. Educational materials were indeed scarce throughout occupied Japan. Many schools remained closed due to damaged buildings, lack of supplies, and the Allied directive to remove all militaristic and ultra-nationalistic content from curricula. This left an entire generation of Japanese children with limited access to formal education at a critical time in their development. "This is important work," Cooper acknowledged. "How can I help?" Midori smiled. "Your handwriting for English words, my handwriting for Japanese. Together, make good books." For the next several hours, they worked side by side creating rudimentary educational materials. Cooper printed English words beneath Midori's elegant Japanese characters, while village artists contributed simple illustrations. The project expanded as other villagers joined throughout the day, bringing whatever paper, ink, or artistic skills they possessed. When Captain Davis visited later that afternoon to discuss the progress of various community initiatives, he found a dozen villagers and 3 off-duty American soldiers engaged in this impromptu publishing operation. He observed silently for several minutes before commenting, "This is remarkable, Mrs. Tanaka," he said when Midori noticed his presence. "You've created a solution to a problem my superiors have been debating for months." Through Nakamura's translation, Midori explained the project's evolution and goals. Davis listened with growing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions about content and distribution plans. "With your permission," he said finally, "I'd like to document this initiative for headquarters. It represents exactly the kind of grassroots cooperation that General MacArthur's staff has been advocating." Midori consented readily, understanding the potential for expanded support. What had begun as a local response to an immediate need might serve as a template for educational reconstruction throughout occupied territories. 2 days later, Davis returned with unexpected news. "Headquarters was impressed by your educational initiative," he informed Midori, with Cooper and Nakamura present as usual. "They've authorized a significant allocation of paper and printing supplies for Hatsushima, with the expectation that you'll continue developing bilingual materials that could potentially be reproduced for other communities." Midori received this news with characteristic grace, bowing formally before responding. "We are honored by the trust shown in our humble efforts," Nakamura translated. "The children of Hatsushima, and perhaps all Japan, will benefit from this generosity." "There's more," Davis continued, his typically reserved demeanor giving way to evident satisfaction. "Your collaborative approach has attracted attention beyond educational concerns. General Eichelberger's staff has designated Hatsushima as a pilot community for a new model of occupation administration, one that emphasizes partnership rather than unilateral control. This announcement represented a significant evolution in occupation policy. While General Douglas MacArthur remained the supreme commander with ultimate authority, the implementation of occupation directives had always allowed for some local variation based on conditions and leadership. What Midori and Davis had created in Hatsushima, largely through pragmatic responses to immediate needs, was now being recognized as potentially valuable on a broader scale. The designation brought both opportunities and challenges. Additional resources flowed to the village, including medical supplies, construction materials, and food supplements. However, increased attention also meant greater scrutiny. Officials from occupation headquarters began making regular visits to observe and document the Hatsushima model in action. Cooper found his role expanding yet again as these developments unfolded. His carpentry skills, which had initially connected him with Midori, became less central than his emerging capability as a cultural intermediary. Both Japanese villagers and American personnel increasingly sought his assistance in navigating cross-cultural interactions. "You have become a bridge, Cooper-san," Midori observed one evening, as they shared a simple meal of rice and vegetables supplemented by American rations. The increasing food supplies had reduced, but not eliminated, the persistent hunger that characterized post-surrender Japan. Cooper considered her metaphor. "I suppose I have," he acknowledged, "though I never intended that role." "The best bridges are built by necessity, not design," Midori replied with the quiet wisdom that continually surprised Cooper. Despite lacking formal education beyond secondary school, she possessed an intellectual depth and philosophical perspective that transcended academic credentials. As winter deepened, bringing cold winds from the mountains and occasional snow to Hatsushima, the collaborative projects continued to evolve. The educational initiative expanded to include adult language classes, with villagers learning English and American personnel studying Japanese. The agricultural program prepared for spring planting with innovative approaches, combining traditional Japanese intensive farming methods with American mechanized techniques. Most significantly, the social fabric of the community underwent a subtle but profound transformation. What had begun as wary cooperation between recent enemies gradually evolved into something resembling genuine community. American soldiers were no longer viewed primarily as occupiers, but as temporary residents with specific roles in village life. Japanese civilians, in turn, were increasingly perceived as partners rather than subordinates in the reconstruction process. This transformation was neither universal nor complete. Pockets of resistance remained on both sides. Some villagers, particularly those who had lost family members during the conflict, maintained a careful distance from the Americans. Similarly, certain soldiers continued to view their Japanese counterparts with ingrained suspicion, products of years of wartime propaganda that could not be immediately overcome. Yet the overall trajectory was unmistakable. Each successful collaboration, each problem solved through joint effort, each moment of cultural exchange strengthened the foundation of mutual respect and understanding that Midori had envisioned during the Obon ceremony. In January 1946, as the occupation entered its 6th month, a significant challenge tested this evolving relationship. A severe winter storm struck the region, bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures that threatened both the village infrastructure and human survival. The Americans, with their superior equipment and supplies, immediately implemented emergency protocols. Villagers, with their generations of knowledge about local conditions, contributed essential insights about priorities and approaches. The crisis management reflected the new reality of Hatsushima. Neither side could have responded as effectively alone as they did together. American generators provided emergency power to critical community buildings. Japanese knowledge of traditional insulation techniques helped conserve precious fuel. Food was pooled and distributed based on need rather than nationality. During this emergency, Midori's home once again served as a central coordination point. Her repaired roof, which had started the entire sequence of collaboration, now sheltered a rotating group of American and Japanese personnel managing the community response. The symbolism was lost on no one, least of all Cooper, who found himself marveling at how far they had come from that first rainy day. On the 3rd night of the storm, as wind howled around the eaves and snow accumulated in deep drifts, Cooper and Midori sat beside her small hearth, reviewing reports on village conditions. Most community members had been successfully sheltered, though supplies remained concerning if the weather continued. "I've been thinking about something, Cooper-san," Midori said suddenly, setting aside the inventory list they had been discussing. Her English had improved significantly over the months of language exchange, though she still preferred Japanese for complex concepts. "What is it?" Cooper asked, noticing the serious set of her expression. "When spring comes," she said carefully, "you will eventually leave Hatsushima." Cooper nodded, feeling a surprising pang at this undeniable truth. His deployment was not permanent. At some point, either through rotation or the eventual scaling back of occupation forces, he would depart from this village that had unexpectedly become significant to him. "What we have built here," Midori continued, "must continue after you and Captain Davis and the others are gone." "It will," Cooper assured her, though he wondered privately how the balance they had achieved would adjust once the American presence diminished. Midori shook her head slightly. "Not without preparation, not without teaching others what we have learned." "What are you suggesting?" "We should write it down," Midori said, her educator's instincts emerging. "Not just what we did, but how we came to understand each other. The steps that allowed former enemies to become—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Not just allies, but friends." Cooper considered this proposal. "A record of the Hatsushima model?" "Yes," Midori nodded eagerly. "For other villages, for other soldiers, for the future when today's pain is only memory." The suggestion resonated with Cooper's own unspoken concerns about sustainability. What they had created in Hatsushima was valuable precisely because it was unusual, a departure from the typical occupation dynamics. Documenting the process might help preserve and potentially replicate the approach. "I think it's an excellent idea," he said finally. "But it should come from both of us, American and Japanese perspectives together." Midori smiled, pleased by his immediate grasp of the essential principle. Yes, 2 voices, 1 story. They began work the following day, using precious paper from the educational supplies to record their experiences and observations. Cooper wrote in English, Midori in Japanese, each reviewing the other's words through their improving bilingual skills. The document they created was not merely a chronology of events, but an analysis of the psychological and cultural factors that had enabled successful cooperation. Captain Davis, upon learning of this project, provided official support, recognizing its potential value to occupation authorities. "This kind of ground-level insight is precisely what headquarters needs," he told Cooper. "The policy directives from Tokyo are necessarily broad. Your experiences here provide the practical implementation details that can make those policies successful." As winter gradually yielded to the first tentative signs of spring, the documentation project expanded to include other voices from the village and the American contingent. Yamamoto-sensei contributed reflections on how his initial fear of the Americans had transformed through direct experience. Lieutenant Henderson wrote about the administrative adjustments that had facilitated cooperation. Sergeant Nakamura added valuable perspectives on the cultural translation challenges and solutions. The result was a remarkably comprehensive account of the Hatsushima experience, a case study in post-conflict reconciliation and cooperative governance that would eventually circulate among occupation authorities throughout Japan. While not all of its lessons could be applied universally, the core principles, mutual respect, shared problem-solving, cultural exchange, and recognition of common humanity, offered valuable guidance for occupation forces struggling with similar challenges elsewhere. In March 1946, as cherry blossoms appeared on the trees surrounding Hatsushima, Cooper received the news he had both expected and dreaded. His unit was being reassigned to Yokohama as part of a broader reorganization of occupation forces. He would be leaving the village within 2 weeks. When he brought this information to Midori, her expression revealed momentary sadness before settling into composed acceptance. "We knew this day would come," she said simply. "Yes," Cooper acknowledged, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of impending separation hanging between them. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have anticipated, not romantic love in the conventional sense, but a profound connection forged through extraordinary circumstances. They had become, as Midori once described it, friends across the divide. Individuals who had discovered common ground where history dictated there should be none. "What will happen to Hatsushima after we leave?" Cooper asked finally. Midori considered the question carefully before responding. "The village will continue. The seeds we have planted together will grow. This, I believe." Her confidence reassured Cooper, though concerns lingered. The Hatsushima model had flourished under specific conditions, with particular individuals who had been willing to transcend historical animosities. Would it survive their departure? As if reading his thoughts, Midori added, "Remember, Cooper-san, what begins with fixing a roof can end with fixing much more. This is what we have learned." The village organized a farewell gathering for the departing American personnel. Unlike the formal military ceremonies that typically marked such transitions, this event reflected the unique relationship that had developed in Hatsushima. Villagers prepared traditional Japanese dishes using ingredients supplemented by American contributions. Children performed songs they had learned in both languages. Small gifts were exchanged, simple items of minimal material value but significant emotional meaning. Captain Davis used the occasion to announce that Hatsushima's designation as a model community would continue under the incoming American leadership. "What you have built here together will not only endure but expand," he promised. "Your experience has already influenced occupation policies elsewhere in Japan." When Cooper's turn came to speak, he found himself struggling with unexpected emotion. "When I first came to Hatsushima," he began, with Nakamura translating, "I saw only a village of former enemies. Today I leave a community of friends." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Mrs. Tanaka once told me that hunger comes in many forms. She was right. We arrived hungry for food, but we were also hungry for understanding, for connection, for a way forward that honored both our differences and our common humanity." He looked directly at Midori as he continued. "What began with a leaking roof became a lesson in rebuilding not just homes, but trust. What started as a simple exchange of labor for food grew into something that might help heal the wounds of war. For this unexpected gift, I will be forever grateful." As the gathering concluded and farewells were exchanged, Cooper found a moment alone with Midori. Words seemed inadequate for the occasion, yet something needed to be said. "I'll write," he promised, "and perhaps someday, when the occupation ends and civilians are permitted to visit Japan again, I'll return to Hatsushima." Midori nodded, her composure briefly wavering. "You will always have a place here, Cooper-san. The roof I asked you to fix will shelter you whenever you return." From a small bundle she withdrew a final gift, a hand-bound copy of their documentation project, written in both languages and inscribed with a simple message, "From Midori Tanaka to Samuel Cooper, 2 voices, 1 story, Hatsushima, 1946. Cooper accepted the book with reverence, understanding its significance not just as a personal memento, but as a testament to what they had accomplished together. "Thank you," he said, the phrase inadequate but heartfelt, "for everything." The following morning, as American trucks prepared to depart Hatsushima, the entire village gathered to bid farewell. Cooper, seated in the lead vehicle, watched the familiar landscape recede, the repaired houses, the shrine where they had observed Obon, the school where bilingual education now flourished, and finally Midori's house with its mended roof that had started it all. What had begun as a hungry soldier, helping a widow repair her home, had evolved into something none could have predicted, a model for reconciliation that would influence occupation policies throughout Japan and, perhaps, offer lessons for future conflicts yet unimagined. Years later, when historians examined the success of the American occupation of Japan, widely regarded as one of the most effective post-conflict reconstructions in modern history, few would connect it to the small-scale initiatives that had emerged in places like Hatsushima. Yet the principles first applied there, mutual respect, collaborative problem-solving, cultural exchange, and recognition of common humanity, would become central to the larger occupation strategy. For Midori Tanaka and Samuel Cooper, however, these grand historical narratives remained secondary to their personal experience. They had discovered, amid the ruins of conflict, the transformative power of simple human connection, a lesson embodied in a repaired roof, shared meals, and the unexpected friendship that flourished when a Japanese widow hired a hungry American soldier and changed not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of reconciliation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.